My name is John Hennessy. I'm here tonight just to kick things off. Tonight we will examine and discuss some of the issues surrounding responsible competitiveness and the global labor force. I think we're here to examine what our responsibilities and goals should be, certainly as individuals, as a university, as a member of an increasingly interconnected global community, and of course, as a university that licenses its name in the manufacturing of apparel. We're here to look at ways in which we can improve the working conditions for people who make that apparel around the world. Of course, we've always exercised great care in how the Stanford name is used. And that should apply not only to the name of the university around the world with respect to our research and education, but also the way in which the name is used with apparel products. We would like the manufacturer of those products to hold the same high standards that we hold on our own campus for creating a safe and fair working environment. Over the past year, I've met with students and looked closely at the issues related to the production of university licensed merchandise. What I can tell you I've learned is that the issue is a lot more complicated than it appears on the surface, and that there are no simple solutions. But just as Stanford has adopted principles on its own core campus, talking about having a healthy, safe, and secure working environment, we should expect the same thing for the products we use and the products that carry our name. Last academic year, Stanford joined two organizations represented here tonight, the Workers' Rights Consortium and the Fair Labor Association. While they have different approaches to trying to improve the conditions for workers overseas, we think each has advantages, and working together, they have the potential to develop more effective programs that could create a sea change for the entire industry. But I think these actions may not be enough. In developing nations, identifying a path to sustainable improvement in working conditions is a complex issue involving many stakeholders. Factories are owned locally and governed by the laws of developing countries, which often, unfortunately, are not enforced. Manufacturers contract with these factories for the production of merchandise, but they have traditionally had very little control or say over the subcontractors and over their labor relationships. Monitoring organizations may try to identify violations of laws and labor codes, but these organizations are limited in their ability to effectively monitor the thousands, and I mean thousands of plants that manufacture apparel around the world. They're challenged in trying to negotiate and enforce remediation plans, all of which require lots of time and effort. When we allow the university name to be used, we must do so with the thought that the workers involved in producing that merchandise would hold to the same standards of just treatment that we would expect on our own campus. However, as a licensor of merchandise, we are many, many steps removed from the manufacture of those products. I'm afraid there are no simple solutions. Just pulling back. For example, the university could forgo all of the licensing income it gets for licensing its name. It's not a lot of revenue in the big picture of the university. That simply would be irresponsible because we wouldn't be participating in improving the situation. The long-term solution, in my mind, the very long-term solution perhaps, will be better local laws and enforcement of labor standards. But that goal is still a long ways from reality in developing countries. Some believe that other solutions, such as limiting production to a small number of certified factories, may work. Others believe that it is possible to create an environment where the factory owners are incentivized to treat their workers better and develop better business processes. But I think in the end, a collaborative approach will be needed, an approach that works with all the stakeholders and tries to find an alignment of interests that works for the university, for consumers, for manufacturers, for product suppliers, and of course, for the employees that are manufacturing this apparel in the end. I was reminded how complex these issues are by a recent paper sent to me by Professor Josh Cohen, dealing with the issue of inspections. I think the first line conclusion of the paper is inspections are not the answer, at least just by themselves. That just made it clear how complicated this problem was. They did hint that improvement in business processes was quite critical, I think something that was promising. One question we should all ask ourselves is what we can do to reach a satisfactory situation earlier than the natural processes might carry us towards. Tonight's panel is an outgrowth of the ongoing discussion about these issues. We've brought together people who are both passionate and creative in the search for solutions. And I'm here, like many of you, to be educated. What has worked, what has not, what new approaches could be developed that might actually make a real change in this challenge. I want to thank our panelists for joining us tonight. I look forward to hearing their thoughts on the issue. And I now want to turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Joshua Cohen, Professor of Political Science, Philosophy and Law, and Director of the Program on Global Justice at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Josh.
Thanks, John. And before I say anything else, I'm looking for Susan. There's Susan Weinstein, who is responsible, really, for making this come together tonight. And I want to just personally say thank you, but also on behalf of everybody else. It's an important thing, and I think you've really been wonderful to work with on it. So the theme tonight is responsible competitiveness, and I want to give my own introduction to the theme by giving a very, very low resolution statement of what I see as the basic issues that we're concerned with here. And I'm going to summarize them in 4 points. The first point was really brought home to me by a presentation I heard recently by political scientist Janice Perlman, who was talking about research that she'd been doing in the favelas around Rio de Janeiro for over a period of almost 40 years. And she had surveyed people 40 years ago and had surveyed their grandchildren now. And she asked the grandchildren, who are themselves now in their teens and 20s, what's the most important factor in having a successful life? And you could give more than one answer, but 3% said security, 5% said faith, 36% said health, 50% said education, 66% said jobs. So the basic starting point for the conversation is people need and want jobs. But also jobs are provided by firms, and firms need to be, this is the responsible competitiveness part, firms need to be competitive in order to provide jobs. So that's basic point number one. Secondly, it says on the gates of hell in Dante's Inferno, abandon your hope, all ye who enter here. And the thing is, the second point is that it's a moral disaster when those words belong on the place where you work. Abandon your hope, abandon your health, abandon your rights of association. And by the way, don't really bother to bring your wallet either, because you're not going to get paid that much for working. So jobs are really basic to a decent life, and firms provide jobs. But it's important that people's need to work, desire to work, be respected and not exploited by providing indecent conditions of compensation or health and safety and denials of rights of association. The third point is that the appropriate standards of compensation and safety and workplaces, the quality of workplaces, I think most people agree that it's appropriate for them to vary across societies depending on the level of economic development. But just as you look at wealthier countries, and there's a lot of variation in wealthier countries on what workers get paid and what health and safety is like in workplaces. The same is true in poorer countries. So poorer countries too, there may be constraints, low level of development, but there's a lot of room for doing better and for doing worse. It's not fixed. And it's good to foster doing better. So that's the third point. The fourth point is there are lots of strategies out there for doing better. But one of them that's emerged over the past decade or so has been really to exploit the power of lead firms in global supply chains, the power of lead firms over their suppliers, and in turn the power of consumers and institutional purchasers over lead firms as a way to generate realistic and sustainable improvements in the way firms treat people who work for them. This isn't the only strategy of improvement, but it's an important one, this more private, decentralized scheme of regulation involving labor codes, monitoring, and assisting firms in compliance with the codes. So those are the four kind of basic points about the space, I think, that we're talking about. Jobs are really important, and firms provide them. It's indecent to exploit people's need to work by providing them with indecent wages and working conditions and denials of rights of association. There are constraints from low levels of economic development, but there's a lot of room for doing better or worse consistent with those constraints. And then fourth, there are lots of strategies of improvement, but there's one in particular that has really been a kind of important experiment over the past decade or so. And that's the focus of the discussion tonight. To talk about what those efforts look like, what successes they've had, what the future prospects of those strategies look like, and then, as President Hennessy said, what Stanford could and should be doing in these areas. We brought together 5 people who've thought about these issues, and the way the conversation is going to work, we'll see if it's a conversation. If I stop talking, it might be a conversation. The way the conversation is going to work is we've asked each of them to give 5 minutes at the beginning, and we even have a sign. Anyway, we'll try to keep them to about, who's counting? Darcy's counting. Yeah. Try to keep them to about 5 minutes. And then we'll open things up for discussion, your questions, and really try to have some kind of conversation about this. So I'm going to introduce people in the order in which they're going to talk, and I'm not going to really give their credentials. You have their credentials. I don't need to repeat them. But I'll just tell you the order in which they're. So Dave Brady, right there. Dave is going to talk first about some business issues, about compliance with labor codes. Then Deborah Satz from, Dave, he's from political science and Hoover, and my colleague from political science. And Deborah Satz from philosophy and director of the Ethics and Society program is going to talk about how we should be thinking about the ethics of the treatment of workers by firms. So she'll talk second, and then Huggy Rao, who's in the GSB. He's going to talk about the role of social movements in moving organizations, these lethargic organizations, in new directions. And then we're going to have our 2 guests in this order. Let's say Scott Nova from the Workers' Rights Consortium, and Aurette, there you are, I didn't see that, Aurette van Heerden from the Fair Labor Association, and they're going to give us 5 minutes on what their organizations are up to in improving compensation and rights of association, working conditions, what the strategy is, kind of brief sketch, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and where they see things going. So, Dave, thank you.
Let me begin by saying that my work in this area is a result of my appointment at the business school and my affiliation with the Center for Social Innovation and teaching a course on corporate social responsibility and ethics. So, for me, the issue is that there are special issues in operating in some developing countries. Among them are the government may not have the means or the expertise to address some matters of importance. Institutions may not be in place or enforcement may be lax. Poverty. People may not have the means to take care of their own interests or defend or exercise their rights. Education may be limited. Excess supply of labor can lead to choices made because of desperation. Activists and active advocacy groups may not be present. So those are set and other conditions that occur. So let me say that what I'm going to talk about are the three companies that I know the most about, and that is Nike, Adidas, and Gap. I have not now or ever been in the employ of any of those companies or received anything, even a pair of free tennis shoes, although I was tempted. So what I want to start out with is the notion of, so I have been in the factories, at least in Vietnam, and some in China, pre and post. So let me say that, first of all, the changes that have come about in the last decade have come about because of the work of NGOs and interest groups that put pressure on Nike, Adidas, and Gap to do more for their workers. So you'll hear more from those people, but the initiative came from them. So it turns out that these companies now are all doing internal audits, some from the FLA. They'll speak about how they do it, and the workers group can talk about that. But the internal audits of these companies do work. The companies, the work conditions and the pay is over the last decade better. I will leave the question of absolutes for later, but the studies show that they've gotten better over time. And largely the studies show that these audits work. They work in the short run, and they work over time. The more you have, the actual better the company, better the factory gets. Now those results are conditional on a number of factors. It means they work, but it's conditional. They work better under certain circumstances. First, smaller factories of about 1,000 are where they work best. There are several competing interpretations why they don't work as well in big factories, but there's no definitive answer on that. Second, countries matter. The more respect the country has for rule of law, the greater the likelihood that the audit shows improvement or better factories. So that, in fact, the less respect for the rule of law, the less likely the factory will score lower. And there, China turns out to be a kind of a particular problem. We can come back to that in the discussion, perhaps. Third, interestingly, nationally owned factories are worse than foreign-owned factories in many developing countries. Four, I only have these results for Nike and Adidas. I do not have these results for Gap. The more that Nike and Adidas control the factory, by which I mean Nike and Adidas don't own the factories, the greater the percentage of the shoes made there are Nike, the higher the factory scores. So the more control Nike or Adidas have over what's produced in the factory, the greater their control, the better the factory operates. And finally, the apparel industry, because it's so decentralized and can be put together in very short runs, not many objects, those factories always score lower than the factories that are footwear because there are longer continual runs on them. So let me turn. So the facts are that things are getting better. Well, the next question is, well, why Nike, Adidas, and Gap? Why are they doing this on their own, or why with the FLA? Why? And the reason is because in these countries and across the world, there's no political entrepreneur. What do I mean by a political entrepreneur? Think of the issue. If there's an issue in the United States or the EU or Japan or Korea, if there's an issue about worker pay, if there's an issue about safety conditions, there are institutions like the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to which you can bring claims. And what does that institution do? It sets a standard, or the Congress sets the standard. It has the ability to monitor whether people are living up to it and punish bad behavior, reward good behavior. Those institutions do not exist worldwide, and they don't exist in the countries where much of this production goes on. Therefore, you get these industry associations and companies doing it individually. And that's not true, by the way, just of international sorts of things. The Chainsaw Manufacturers Association in the United States has the lowest possible standards because they can't agree on safety standards for chainsaws. Same sort of problem. So the U.S. Congress won't pass one, so you get the low ball. That doesn't mean that companies can't do more than these associations set up. And I'm just going to read some of the things that Nike and Adidas have done in addition to that. They have, in addition to what the FLA, which I'll tell you about later, Nike has a policy, a minimum age of 18 for footwear, 16 for apparel. The U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration standards are used in all Nike factories, and the European Union standards are used in all Adidas factories. They ended the use of polyvinyl chloride in shoes. Entry wages 70% in Indonesia. Children stay on payroll and still go to school if they were affected by this. Recycling of shoes. So there's all sorts of things that they've done in addition to the minimal standard, and many companies do that. So the question is, then they've made some improvements, and I continue to see that the work of NGOs and these institutional arrangements will make the situation better over time. The question then is, well, where won't it work? And I'm going to finish. So that's pretty positive thus far. And given my reputation, I don't want to finish too positively, so I want to finish on a negative, and that is where there won't be agreement. Now, the idea of this political entrepreneur, President Clinton brought the needle trades industry in just before he left office, 1999-2000, tried to get an agreement, brought labor unions, NGOs, everybody together. They spent quite a little time, as you might expect. It broke apart. Some people, and that's how the FLA got started. Why did it break apart? The two major issues where I do not see agreement coming anytime in the near future are, first, living versus market wages. That is an issue that is not just international. It's an issue at Stanford. There was a claim by workers that they're not getting living wages, or they're getting market wages and not living wages. That is an incredibly tough problem. I know that Nike got 2 Nobel laureates and Ann Krieger to work on the problem of what to do with market versus living wages. And they're, after 2.5 years, that's 2 Nobel laureates and another exceedingly smart economist. And their conclusion was somewhat muddled, but what they decided to do was to say that the right thing to do in this case was, if you really want to grow an economy and you don't want distortions, where you pay some people too much and others not enough to grow the economy, the best thing you can do is educate half the population. In most of the countries where Nike's occupied, women don't receive as high an education. So the Nike Foundation, under the leadership of Maria Eitel, and Adidas has a similar one. What they do is they contribute money for women. They establish schools and pay teachers, and for schools for girls up through, I think, 8th grade. And the idea is the best way to grow the economy is to educate that half the workforce that isn't working. So that living versus market wage is a very, very complicated issue. And they have an interesting paper on it. I recommend you reading it. I still don't understand it. Two, that's one issue. And the second issue, labor unions in China. I think the issue of labor unions in China is a very tough issue. We're going to talk about it later. And I think that's close to 5 minutes.
Thank you. Deborah.
Hi. Can you hear me? I don't feel like the mic is on. Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to kind of step back a little and talk more abstractly about 2 different moral approaches that somebody could take. Let me just start with, just to echo some of the things that Josh said. There's a diversity of labor standards and practices around the world. While some diversity is appropriate, there are people in the world today who live and work under conditions that nobody should live and work under. And second, not only are the conditions repellent, but that we're linked through very complex and indirect ways to people working under very, very horrible conditions. And so that raises the question, how should we respond? And there are lots of, my colleagues on the panel are going to talk about different methods for improving labor standards, in particular monitoring. But I want to focus on a moral argument that's often raised in the debates about labor standards, and that's the argument that doing good doesn't do good. That is, it's sometimes argued that efforts by activists in the advanced countries to raise labor standards in the developing world, although well-intentioned, actually do more harm to those that they want to help. And so I want to contrast 2 positions somebody might take to the production of goods made under very, very poor conditions. And I'll call the first an approach based on the ethics of integrity. So somebody who adopts an ethics of integrity doesn't want themselves to be implicated in poor labor practices. That is, whether or not such practices continue to occur, the focus of an ethics of integrity is on what one is doing, not on what's happening. So somebody motivated by such an ethic doesn't want to be complicit in human misery, even if they know that human misery will continue, maybe even get worse given their actions. So when surveyed by the National Bureau of Economic Research, but there have been numerous studies, most consumers say that if faced with a choice between identical T-shirts made with the same logo but made under very different conditions, they choose the garment made under better conditions, even if it cost a bit more. They don't say that they're concerned beyond that with the long-term effects of their actions. Activists capitalize on this moral approach, and they produce campaigns which provide information about the conditions under which people buy products. So that's a first approach. Sometimes it's called the dirty hands approach. I don't want to get my hands dirty in participating in a situation where people are being treated undecently and unjustly. I'll call a second approach an ethics of consequences. According to this approach, what matters is what happens to people, whether or not you're directly involved in producing the outcome. According to the ethic of consequences, if I'm faced with the possibility of preventing a greater evil by producing a lesser one, I should choose the lesser evil. Somebody motivated by an ethics of consequence might argue that activist interventions in markets simply wind up making things worse, and that doing good does no good. If activists discourage exports from the less developed countries and reduce foreign investment in countries with poor labor standards, this will lower the demand for labor and reduce worker well-being. Ethics, the argument goes, undermines competitiveness, and when firms aren't competitive, they can't provide jobs. As Paul Krugman once put it, I don't know if he would say this today, but, quote, in defense of cheap labor, bad jobs at bad wages are better than no jobs at all. And I think most of us feel the pull of these two types of approaches. The pull of integrity, of not wanting to be involved in and to participate and be complicit in practices in which people are treated unjustly, and at the same time, the pull of consequences. And I think many times people counterpose these, and so an objection that's often made to people arguing against sweatshops or for interventions in markets is your hands might be clean, but the very people you want to help are now going to be worse off. And I certainly think that sometimes in life we wind up with moral blind alleys or dead ends, places where we're forced into a situation where we can't see a way out, a way of reconciling these two pulls on our kind of moral thinking. But I think it's false to suggest, or maybe this is, I'm uncharacteristically optimistic here, for somebody who usually thinks the world is evil, I don't think it's that evil that we're always put in a position where we have to choose between an ethics of integrity and an ethics of conscience. That is, I think somebody motivated by an ethics of integrity can and should take into account the bad consequences of their ethical action and try to ameliorate them. When groups seeking to do good are conscious of the risks that their actions pose, they may be able to develop both the means and ends of accordingly to improve situations. So given the lack of time, let me give one example where I think the two ethics can actually work together, and then I'll conclude. So child labor is often considered a kind of paradigm case for thinking about this dilemma. On the one hand, people understandably have very strong objections to employing children in factories. On the other hand, the worry is that campaigns against child labor in factories will have the consequence of displacing children to even worse activities, such as child prostitution or the use of children in war, or in some cases, simply starvation. So let me give you an example of a program that I think did a job bringing these together. The ILO has a program, the International Program on the Elimination of Child Labor, which is oriented on replacing child labor with better opportunities. And in the mid-90s, activists exposed the use of child labor in the Bangladeshi garment industry and in the soccer ball industry in Pakistan, and pressured retailers to address the problem. The initial industry response in Bangladesh was to throw the children out in the street. But the ILO and UNICEF intervened, demanding that a more constructive solution be found. Manufacturers agreed not simply to stop employing children, but to cooperate and assist with the funding of programs to put children in schools or to train them, and to allow the ILO to monitor the results. Similarly, consumers buying rug mark labeled child-free carpets pay a premium that, in addition to paying the cost of certification, goes to building schools for the affected children. In Mexico, a World Bank-funded program offers scholarships for children, paid to a designated woman of the household, and conditional on the child's school attendance, and that's been very successful in reducing child labor without further harming children. So I think it's possible to imagine how an ethics of integrity can be combined with other kinds of mechanisms to take into account the consequences of the unintended consequences of ethical action. I also think we don't know enough about the world to know what works and what doesn't work. So things that we might worry about, that we might think, by intervening will make things worse, may have the effect of sometimes changing the climate or changing the terms of the moral debate. So when activists put pressure on companies, when people suddenly start to feel that, we were talking about Prius drivers before, that there's a premium to be gotten by showing that you're doing good, you can change the environment. So my point is, there's nothing in economic analysis that guarantees good or bad outcomes from morally motivated action, and there's nothing in moral philosophy that prevents those motivated by concerns of integrity or principle from acting with sensitivity to the risks of bad consequences from their morally motivated action. Sometimes we might wind up in a blind alley where we have to draw a line. And indeed, the ILO, for example, does draw lines. It says there's some practices, what they call the worst practices, where we should simply not tolerate the use of children in prostitution, whatever the alternatives. But there's no reason to think that we have to behave badly in order to do good. And so I wanted to make that rather mundane point because it turns out to be very contentious in these arguments. Thanks.
Huggy, it's your responsibility to hold down the dark side now.
Yeah, right. Good evening, everyone. Adam Smith, developed the notion that the invisible hand guides markets. But when we really look around, what we see is it's the visible joined hands of activists that shape markets. Social movements exert a profound effect on markets. Sometimes they create new niches within an existing market. Think microbrewing. Market concentration in the brewing industry is 97 or 98%, yet America has more independently owned breweries than Germany, even though Germany has far lesser amounts of market concentration. Social movements also promote the growth of new technologies. Arguably, the personal computing movement made possible the personal computing industry. On the other hand, movements also can thwart technologies. think of the deaf rights movement and how it prevented, if you will, the diffusion of cochlear ear implants that were going to be implanted in young children. Because the deaf community said, wait a minute, you're killing our culture. You can make analogous arguments about laws. The women's movement had a big effect on laws, as did the civil rights movement. What's interesting about the anti-sweatshop movement is it's a compelling example of how social movements promote the growth of new standards on the one hand and new watchdogs on the other. Let me back up here and say, what is a social movement? It's an organized collective endeavor to create social change. Well, when do movements arise? They arise when normal economic incentives aren't enough, when you have a party that feels marginalized, experiences a grievance, or when there is a constituency that lacks legal rights that are either clearly defined or are enforceable. So when you think of the anti-sweatshop movement, you could imagine a world in which normal incentives could play a role. After all, why couldn't producers actually differentiate themselves in the apparel industry from the others by saying, hey, we pay a great wage, we give the rights of free association, and so on and so forth. Why don't they differentiate? And the problem here is normal incentives aren't really operative as effectively as one would like, for a variety of reasons that we can get into later. And the other thing is, the workers who are the target of the anti-sweatshop movement, they lack legal rights. And of course, the anti-sweatshop movement that took off in the 1990s, arose certainly from universities, which are wonderful kind of hothouses of activism. But first, let's ask ourselves, why do you need a social movement to actually change the plight of workers in the global supply chain? One reason is, when you look at large players in the apparel industry, or for that matter, other industries, large firms, we know, are inertial. They're bureaucratic, they're lethargic. The key resource in large firms is the attention of top executives. It's a very scarce resource. Things don't get on their radar screen. There is also actually, more recently, a very interesting line of work in social psychology that suggests that higher status individuals tend to think more stereotypically. They don't engage in much diagnostic search. The reason is they don't depend much on the world. And certainly that's the case with large organizations. If you're in a smaller organization, you depend on the world, therefore you're going to engage in a lot more diagnostic search. So what do you need? You need the voice option. That's what the anti-sweatshop movement supplies. It puts the issue on the table of top managers and says, hey, here's a wake-up call. How do they wake them up? Not by organizing large protests necessarily. There's a recent study that's just about to be published which shows what matters is media coverage. One day of media coverage in the New York Times, the day after that, the stock price takes a hit anywhere from 0.4% to 1%. The size of the protest doesn't matter. It's the media coverage that you get matters. How is it that media coverage of protest quickly gets impounded into stock prices? The answer here has to do with brands. We often think of brands as pertaining to, judgments that people make about products, but brands also consist of feelings that people have about products. And the one thing we know consistently is, if you take any brand, negative information is far more stickier than positive information. And it doesn't matter that the negative information necessarily has to do with the product. It could even have to do with non-product related things. So, that's how, when you put pressure, things get on the board on the radar screen of top managers. The stock price can take a hit because of media coverage. The brand value is diluted. There is also another reason why the voice option actually is crucial, and that is that you can't sort of simply think of violations of worker rights as an isolated occurrence. Dave Larker, my colleague in accounting, and I have been talking about doing a project which suggests that worker or safety violations, for example, consumer violations, and investor fraud, they're all linked together in a very contagious process. You can't think of one as being unconnected with the other. They're all very, very contagious. So that's the reason why these movements actually matter. Now, an important question. What matters? Do standards matter or does pressure matter? My colleagues who've come before me have briefly reviewed how standards are useful. Having standards obviously is better than having no standards. But the other side is standards can become a window dressing if you're not careful. Can pressure work? Yeah, but it's episodic. You've got to sustain that pressure. Very hard to do that. So what do you need? You really not only need to worry about the supply chain, you've got to worry about the demand side. You've got to influence consumers so that they're willing to pay more. And there is indeed emerging evidence in marketing that suggests that consumers, when they buy things like apparel, as well as mutual funds and the like, they're actually extending their definition of themselves. At dinner, we were talking of an interesting study that showed that people were willing to purchase a product that was ethically made, provided it had a large enough price premium. If it had a very small price premium, the claim that it was ethically made would not be believable by consumers. So I have a minute left. The upshot of all of this is you can't just worry about the supply side, you have to worry about the demand side. And I think if you worry about, and there is promising evidence. Gap, for example, has the red T-shirt line, for instance, where people are paying more and so forth. So if we are able to work more on the consumer side, what you would have is the creation of a natural incentive for firms to differentiate themselves. So movements can also put in place by educating, by moralizing consumers, they can create natural incentives for firms to go about the business that they're actually attuned and tailored to engage in. Thank you very much.
So, Scott, so far you've heard that your work is successful and well-motivated and, in fact, essential. So, what's left to see? Yeah.
I'm going to stop right there.
Okay.
Joshua, thanks very much, and thanks to Stanford and for inviting me, and to all of you for being here tonight. Just very quickly on the organization I work for, the Worker Rights Consortium. We are a global labor rights monitoring organization. Our function is to investigate working conditions in factories around the world, particularly those that produce clothing that ultimately bears the names and logos of universities and colleges in the United States. We have 175 universities that have affiliated with the organization and asked us to assist them in enforcing the labor standards they have applied to their relationships with apparel companies for the production, the purpose of producing this product. We have, over the course of 7 years of work in the field, managed to contribute significantly at some factories in some countries to efforts by workers to achieve very substantial changes in their working conditions. There have been real successes as a result of this work. The efforts of universities to apply standards and seek meaningful enforcement of those standards have led to great improvements for many workers in a number of factories. That said, we've also learned over time that the effectiveness of the university codes and of the monitoring systems operated by organizations like ours are limited in critical ways. They're limited in terms of the number of factories that can be affected. They're limited in terms of the depth of the change that can be achieved. And they're limited in terms of the sustainability of that change over time at a particular factory. And I want to talk about why that's the case, because recognizing that problem, of course, has led us to a lot of thinking about how to make the codes more effective, about how to make these monitoring systems more effective? And the answer, I think, begins with understanding the way that the corporations that produce the product look at these issues. And I'm talking now about the large apparel brands like those that David mentioned, like Nike, like Adidas, that are the most important players in the world of university logo apparel. It's important to understand that these brands do not view the issue of labor rights in the developing world as a moral issue. For them, it is an issue of risk management. They are concerned about the degree to which their brand image being associated with something very unpopular in the eyes of consumers, sweatshop conditions, exploitative labor conditions. They're concerned about the degree to which that association might damage the value of their brand, which for companies like Nike and Adidas is their single most valuable asset. Not the running shoe designs, not the apparel styles, but the name in which these brands have invested enormous sums of money and a great deal of creativity and dozens of endorsement contracts over the years. They've constructed very valuable brands. They're concerned about maintaining the integrity of those brands. And they view the sweatshop issue as posing a real risk. And so to the degree to which activists have been able to convince these brands that their failure to address the sweatshop issue effectively constitutes a meaningful risk to their reputation, the brands have acted. In the early and mid-1990s, when the sweatshop issue reemerged with the expose involving Kathy Lee Gifford, with exposés involving Nike's footwear factories in Vietnam, the initial response of all of the major brands was to deny responsibility for the working conditions in their overseas factories. They said, these are not our factories, they're contractors, which was true. We have neither the ability nor the right to dictate how those separate independent companies run their businesses. That didn't work. Consumers didn't accept it. It didn't address the risk to brand reputations. Consumers didn't find it credible. So the brands needed to move further than that. And that led them to acknowledge officially responsibility for the wages, for the working conditions, for the level of respect for worker rights in their contract factories all around the world. That was a huge change, a signal accomplishment of the anti-sweatshop movement. The problem is that pressure that activists placed on the brands, the degree to which activists were able to convince the brands that that reputational risk existed, has not to date been sufficient to move the brands far enough to actually achieve the kinds of changes we would like to see. In other words, while the brands have acknowledged responsibility, adopted codes, set up monitoring programs, they haven't done the critical things that are necessary to actually achieve fundamental change in the working conditions in their global supply chains. And I want to talk very briefly about what those steps are. It's important to understand why sweatshop conditions persist in the global apparel industry, despite all of the talk about this issue over the last 2 decades. Bearing in mind, these are contract factories producing for brands like Nike and Adidas, and there are many of these factories, and they compete with each other for the business of brands like Nike and Adidas. The relationship between Nike and a contract factory, legally speaking, is a very short-term one. There's a contract for an order of apparel. When that order is done, the factory may or may not get another contract from Nike, and the brands move rapidly between suppliers, between countries. It creates a situation of intense competition between factories for the business of the brands. The brands, understandably, predictably, I would argue, use this to force prices down, to bargain down prices. It creates a situation of intense price pressure on the factories and great insecurity about where their next order is going to come from, where their livelihood will come from. Thus, factories have a tremendous incentive to do everything they possibly can to slash production costs. And the factor of production over which factories have by far the most control is labor costs. Factories can reduce labor costs by ignoring labor standards. And because the factories are located in countries which, as several of the speakers have noted, do not meaningfully enforce their labor laws, factories understand that if they do, in fact, violate the rights of workers as a means of reducing production costs, they can do so with impunity. There will not be a government labor rights inspector that will come in and take meaningful enforcement action against them. This is the combination, the tremendous incentive on the part of factories to keep production costs to an extreme minimum as a result of the price pressure from the brands under which they operate, combined with a legal environment in which the factories essentially have free rein to abuse their employees. This is why these conditions exist and why they persist in the global supply chains of major brands. Fixing that problem requires more than simply telling the factory to improve standards and sending an inspector in to see what has and hasn't happened in the factory. It requires addressing the fundamental underlying cause, which is the intense price pressure under which the factories operate. As a practical matter, it costs more to produce under good working conditions than bad conditions. You have factories around the world in these brand supply chains that have for years succeeded in meeting the very tough price demands of their customers by exploiting workers, by refusing to comply with the labor standards with which they should be complying. Suddenly these factories are told you cannot do this anymore. You cannot cut costs anymore by violating worker rights. But the factories are also told they must still meet the same price they were expected to meet when it was fine for them to violate worker rights. Places the factories in quite a bind. They're told they're supposed to improve labor practices, but to do so will raise production costs in such a way as to require the factory to receive a higher price for the product. But they understand that the customer is not going to provide that higher price. The customer expects the factory to produce at the same price the factory was producing at before the code obligations existed. If the brands were genuinely committed to achieving fundamental transformation of working conditions in their supply chain, real respect for the rights of workers, they would adjust the prices they pay their factories to ensure that the price the factory receives is adequate to cover the cost of producing under good working conditions. Their failure to do so creates a situation in which the incentive for most factories is not to comply with the labor standards, because to comply is to raise production costs and render the factory uncompetitive in the marketplace. We will not see the goal of respect for the rights of workers in global apparel supply chains achieved until those incentives are reversed, until the brands who operate these supply chains pay a price that makes it both feasible and desirable for the factory to actually meet the standards. The factory must believe that there will be a reward for complying with the labor standards and that the price that is received will be sufficient to make it possible for that compliance to occur. And that hasn't happened yet. Until it does, we won't be able to move forward. And this is where I think universities come in. How do we get the brands to go that next step? How do we move them further? Well, pressure on their reputations is one mechanism. The possibility of a positive incentive, the lure of an economic opportunity in the form of a market for so-called sweat-free goods may be an option. But universities have a particular lever, which is the contractual relationship, the licensing agreement with the apparel company, without which the apparel company cannot produce a university logo product. Universities have the power, as they have by imposing codes of conduct in the first place, to require as a condition of these licensing agreements that the brands, the licensees, pay their factories a price commensurate with the cost of producing under the labor standards universities have embraced. And this is the approach that we believe is essential toward moving this effort forward. Now, there are a variety of other issues. There are other changes in supply chain management that are necessary. There isn't time in my brief comments here to go into them, so I'm oversimplifying to a degree. But this really is the core of it, the need to make sure that the price the factory receives is commensurate with the cost of producing in compliance with the labor standards. I look forward to talking to you more.
Arette and I are friends on Facebook, so it's good to see you. Yeah.
Say no more.
No, you should
Say
see
no
his. No, he's got videos.
Thanks, Josh. I want to pick up on what a couple of the other speakers have been saying and describe what I think is almost the perfect regulatory storm. And most of us tonight are wearing clothes and shoes that were made in that perfect storm. The traditional form of regulation of labor markets and the traditional system of protection of labor rights at work was based on the notion that the ILO would develop conventions and recommendations adopted by a tripartite consensus that would set hours and set procedures for fixing wages and enshrine rights of association, protect people against discrimination. And those international conventions would then be adopted into national laws, labor laws, and they would be backed by enforcement mechanisms. The departments of labor would have inspectorates, health and safety agencies would have inspectorates. And beneath those official enforcement mechanisms, we would have a second layer of protection provided by labor relations. Organized employers and organized workers would come together and they would strike bargains to regulate their particular workplaces, to set the terms and conditions within that framework of law. And if those two broke down, you would have a third layer of protection which consisted of appeal mechanisms, labor tribunals or mediation and arbitration councils that you could apply to get some kind of relief if your rights had been violated. The problem has been that over the last 20 or 30 years, those enforcement mechanisms have been breaking down. Governments continue to adopt ILO conventions, they continue to pass new labor laws, but they're not enforcing them. And so your essential framework of law is now shot full of holes. At the second level, we've seen a shrinking of trade union organization around the world. The trade union density, as it's called in various countries, in most countries, has shrunk to alarming levels. We've just had, I happen to live in France, and we've just had 10 days of strikes about some public sector reforms in France. And in the middle of these, they quoted the levels of trade unionism. Now, France is known to be a country with quite a militant labor movement. Level of trade unionism is about 5% in the private sector. And this is a country where you have all of the associational rights you could ever wish to have. So we've seen a decline, shall we say, at least a temporary one, in the levels of workers' organizations. And at the same time, we've seen a growth of what you would call a neoliberal approach amongst employers who are saying, we don't need regulation, we need deregulation, we need less regulation. And along with this, we've seen an increasing hostility to notions like collective bargaining and collective agreements, because these are seen to be forms of regulation which introduce rigidities into labor markets and basically reduce companies' flexibility and competitiveness. So those three layers, international conventions, national laws, and labor relations, have basically been unraveling. The second trend which compounds this problem is that we've seen a profound shift in the nature of the firm over the last 50 or 60 years. You know, in the early part of the 19th century, companies were often based in a community where the management of the company came from that community, their workers came from that community, and often their consumers were in that community. And there was a link between the firm and its consumers. With the growth of share ownership, the ownership of the company shifted increasingly to anonymous institutional investors. The management of the firm received share options, and their interests became more and more aligned with those of the anonymous institutional investors, less and less aligned with the firm and its community. So you had the management of the actual stewardship of companies shift away from managers with a commitment to the company and a commitment to their communities and consumers to a commitment to entirely anonymous institutional investors. And the sole overriding fiduciary responsibility of those managers is to increase quarterly returns. It trumps all other considerations. So you're now dealing with these firms driven by the profit motive in its most naked and greedy form, operating in environments which are increasingly unregulated. The third feature I want to highlight is that these firms, in their search for increased shareholder value, have broken down functions within their labor processes, their production processes, and parceled them out to the most competitive environments they can possibly find. And you won't believe the extent to which they've actually sliced and diced those functions. So more and more of the production functions now take place offshore and in highly unregulated environments. So you've got production now driven by a single profit motive in environments which are no longer regulated by law or labor relations, and where the profit motive trumps all others. So you end up with a situation where a lot of rights, a lot of benefits, a lot of basic standards get hollowed out. And where, frankly, the respect for standards now depends on a manager in a factory in Bangladesh or India or China or Mexico deciding to do the right thing. Because there's no other requirement on him to do the right thing, or her, for that matter. There's no legal enforcement, there's no accountability in those jurisdictions that is going to require them to do the right thing. So if they decided, for example, not to provide personal protective equipment to workers, no local agency would hold them accountable for that. So into this perfect storm, we now need the life raft, or we need the white knight to arrive. And basically, that's been provided by civil society, the kinds of movements that Huggy was talking about earlier. You've had, along with this globalization of production chains, you've also seen a globalization of information flows. And civil society has stepped in to fill that regulatory vacuum and used the most powerful lever that it has at its disposal, which is mainly information. And so they've been able to project these issues onto a global stage in a way that civil society movements have never been able to do before. When they projected these issues out, when they said, look, this is how your clothes are being made by children in Bangladesh, or this is how workers who put your sneakers together are being poisoned in Vietnam, they needed somebody to take responsibility for that. Somebody had to actually respond to that demand, to that expose. And if you looked at that global supply chain, the most effective actor that we could require action and responsibility from is the multinational company. So along with this perfect storm that I'm describing, you have the rather anomalous situation now where we are turning to the multinational company and asking it to assume responsibility to enforce labor laws which governments are no longer enforcing. We're asking them to restore labor relations which have disintegrated in many of these countries. We're asking them to restore to workers their rights to associate and to bargain with the suppliers who are supplying those multinational companies. And we've ended up with the most incredibly anomalous situations, where Reebok has organized free trade union elections with AFL-CIO monitors in footwear factories in China. Technically, that's a violation of ILO standards. The employer should not get involved in trade union elections and in any way, shape, or form. But given the absurdity of the situation in China, this is now, and the absurdity of this perfect storm that I'm describing, this is now, to us, the lesser of all of the evils. If Reebok will step in and organize free trade union elections, it's anomalous, it's absurd, it's weird, but it's better than nothing. And you could even argue that maybe this is where we're going. We work in about 60 different countries, and I've been working in those countries for over the last 10 years, and I've seen official regulation shrink in that time. It's receded. And I don't see those enforcement agencies making a comeback anytime soon. So frankly, I think we are in search of a new form of regulation. And where the multinational company, as the most powerful actor in the global economy, and certainly in these global production chains, is a key player, and where you could envisage a scenario where educated and aware and mobilized and organized consumers demand of the brand name company that they assume responsibility to at least ensure the basic minimum standards of law, of wages, of health and safety, of associational rights, and that private actor step in and fill the vacuum left by the public agencies. The problem with this, and Huggy outlined other problems, but one of the problems with it is that when governments enforce laws, that's because they were elected and mandated to do so, and they're accountable to their electorates. When a multinational company steps in and decides to, at our request, at our demand, to enforce laws. They're not elected, they're not mandated, and they're often not accountable. And so we need to, if we are going to ask private actors to deliver public goods, we're going to need to develop appropriate systems of mandate and accountability to go with those. And that's essentially what the Fair Labor Association is trying to do. Somebody mentioned earlier the meeting at the White House in 1996 where President Clinton got the industry, the unions, the Department of Labor, the human rights NGOs together and said that he didn't want to see globalization as a race to the bottom, didn't know how to prevent that, but that he was at least going to use his good offices to get people together to figure out a system. And they spent 4 years negotiating the methodology. And it involved the companies accepting responsibility they'd never accepted before for social and labor conditions throughout their supply chains, agreeing to a code of conduct which they would attach to their contracts, so it would actually be a condition of doing business with those companies, that they would conduct internal audits to make sure that that their suppliers were respecting the code, and that they would agree to external verification, and which is what the Fair Labor Association do. So in one sense, what we're doing is we're trying to provide that framework now in which the multinational can be mandated and held accountable for ensuring respect for labor rights in countries where, unfortunately, the official agencies are no longer doing that. It's an experiment. It's very early days. It doesn't always work. It's horrendously complicated. There are no blacks, there are no whites. They're all shades of gray. Consumers hate shades of gray. People were saying earlier that a lot of this depends on consumers remaining active, remaining vigilant, and actually exercising the power of choice in order to reward ethical conduct. A lot of these issues are just too many shades of gray for the consumer to figure it out. And so they've been a highly unreliable ally in this initiative. So as you were saying earlier, we're in this for the long haul, and nobody has the perfect solution to this perfect regulatory storm. Thank you very much.